Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we try to cut through the noise around frontier models. We get right into the numbers, the quantitative stuff from the actual research papers.
Yeah, and today we're really diving deep into an architectural showdown. We're breaking down this paper, XLSTM scaling laws, competitive performance with linear time complexity, Beck, Schweihofer, and others.
Right, and it's a direct comparison, isn't it? Pitting the dominant transformer architecture against this challenger. XLSTM, one's quadratic, one's linear complexity. That's the core tension.
Exactly. And our mission really is crucial for anyone out there designing or deploying these big models. We want to unpack the hard data. Which one actually gives you more bang for your buck, computationally speaking, XLSTM or a standard transformer like Llama 2 here?
Yeah. And, maybe even more importantly, how do their scaling behaviors differ? Especially, as context lengths get longer and longer, which seems to be the trend, this could really dictate the economics of future models.
Absolutely. If XLSTM really scales better, it could genuinely signal a major shift, a different way to build these things moving forward.
Okay, so let's give everyone the quick takeaway first. The 1-minute version for your next team meeting or stand-up.
You got it. The punchline is, XLSTM looks like it offers a kind of fundamental economic advantage over the transformer, based on this study.
Oh, so?
Well, the main finding is pretty clear. XLSTM scales really well, favorably compared to transformers. In training specifically, the XLSTM models were Pareto Dominant.
Okay, Pareto Dominant. Let's just quickly define that again.
Right. It means across this huge range of compute, they tested, we're talking nearly 5 orders of magnitude, from like 2.8 by 1018 up to 8.5 by 22 FLOPs.
Wow, okay.
XLSTM was consistently better. It achieved a lower validation loss and required less training compute to get there. It's like getting a better result for less effort, essentially.
Better and cheaper. Got it.
And then there's context scaling. This is where that linear complexity really starts to matter. The performance gap, that advantage for XLSTM, it gets wider as the context length grows, both in training and inference.
Because the transformer's quadratic cost just keeps climbing with longer sequences, right? While XLSTM stays linear.
Precisely. And that translates directly into speed, especially in inference. If you match them by model size, the XLSTMs were significantly faster. They saw like 30 to 50% lower time to first token TTFT when using long prompts, say 16,000 tokens.
That's the time you wait for the very first word to appear.
Exactly. And maybe the real killer feature, the generation speed after that first token, the step time. For XLSTM, it's basically constant. It doesn't matter how long the prompt was.
Or as the transformer slows down.
Right. The transformer step time degrades as the prompt gets longer because it has to process that growing KV cache.
Okay, that's huge for usability. And the last key point.
Compute optimality. For a given training budget, the best performing XLSTM model actually ends up being larger, more parameters than the best transformer. But crucially, that optimal XLSTM size stays pretty stable even when you crank up the context length. The transformer's optimal size shrinks.
Interesting. So it suggests XLSTM is maybe inherently better suited to handling more parameters efficiently, especially in long context scenarios.
That seems to be the implication, yeah. It sets up a really fascinating comparison. But before we dig into the results further, we absolutely have to talk about the setup, the methodology.
Right, because getting the scaling laws right is everything here. If you don't measure the computational cost accurately, the whole comparison is flawed.
Totally. So scaling laws, fundamentally, they're predictive tools. They try to predict performance, usually cross-entropy loss, L, based on the compute C you throw at it. And that compute C is a function of the model size, N, and the dataset size, D.
Okay, and the paper looked at different ways of spending that compute budget.
Yes, 2 key regimes. First, the standard compute optimal way, often called M-star. This is where you try to find the perfect balance between model size N and data size D to get the best possible loss for a fixed compute budget, H. For transformers, people often use a rule of thumb, like M-star is around 22 tokens per parameter.
But that's not always how people train in practice, is it?
No, exactly. Which brings us to the second regime, overtraining. So M is much larger than M-star. This is where you take a smaller model, maybe one that's cheaper to run an inference, and train it on way more data than the optimal amount. Some research, like Sardana et al., argues this is often better overall when you factor in the actual deployment costs.
So you need scaling laws that work reliably in both regimes.
You do, and this leads to the experimental rigor needed here. You can't just approximate the FLOPs like some older studies did. Some older work might even ignore the attention cost or just use a simple, 6ND formula.
But that completely misses the point here, right? The whole comparison hinges on the difference between quadratic attention and XLSTM's linear mechanism.
Precisely. So they had to use a really meticulous FLOP calculation, one that accurately captures the quadratic cost of self-attention in the transformer versus the linear cost in XLSTM.
And they did this at scale.
Oh yeah, huge scale. They ran 672 separate training runs. 380 for XLSTM, 292 for the transformer baseline. Models ranging from 80 million parameters all the way up to 7 billion. It's a massive undertaking, clearly designed to isolate that architectural cost difference properly.
Okay, so the methodology seems solid. Let's get to the payoff then. Section 2, training efficiency.
Yeah.
You mentioned Pareto Dominance earlier.
Right, and when you actually look at their plots, figure 1 in the paper, it's visually striking. The XLSTM results form a curve that's consistently below and to the left of the transformer curve on a loss versus compute graph.
Meaning?
Meaning for any amount of compute you choose on the horizontal axis, the XLSTM point vertically below it has a lower loss. Or for any target loss level on the vertical axis, the XLSTM point horizontally to its left required less compute to achieve it. It's strictly better across the board in their experiments.
That really hammers home the efficiency point. More performance per FLOP, period.
Pretty much. But it's not just about the absolute best performance for a given compute budget. It's also about how reliably these models improve, especially in that overtraining zone.
The zone where you might pick a smaller model for faster inference but still want it to get better as you feed it tons of data.
Exactly. You need confidence that the loss will keep going down predictably, following a nice power law, even if your token to parameter ratio, M, gets really high.
And the paper looked into this. They fit some kind of loss surface.
They did.
Yeah.
They fit a parametric function, LND, to model the loss based on both model size and data size, even deep into overtraining. And what they found was encouraging for XLSTM.
Which was?
The power law exponents, the ETA values that describe how quickly loss drops with compute, were consistent for XLSTM, even at really high M values, up to 2,200 tokens per parameter.
So just as reliable as transformers in terms of predictable improvement during training, but starting from a better baseline.
That's the takeaway, yeah. It suggests you can train these potentially smaller, inference-friendly XLSTM models on massive data sets and expect consistent gains, just like with transformers, but more efficiently overall. That predictability is vital for planning long training runs.
Okay, so point taken. XLSTM seems cheaper and more reliable to train. But you mentioned the transformer's real weakness shows up with long contexts. Let's unpack that now. Section 3.
Right. This is where that fundamental difference in complexity, linear versus quadratic, really comes home to roost. They used what's called the isoflop approach here. You fix the total training compute budget, H, and then figure out the best way to spend it. What's the optimal model size, N star, and the optimal data size, D star?
Yeah, and the first surprise maybe was about the model size itself.
Yeah, a bit counterintuitive at first. For the same compute budget H, the optimal XLSTM model, N star, was consistently larger. It had more parameters than the optimal transformer.
Which sort of explains why it performs better, right? For the same training cost, it can afford to be a bigger, potentially more capable model.
That's the heuristic explanation, exactly. Because the core operations in XLSTM are cheaper, you can spend more of your FLOP budget on parameters, making the model deeper or wider rather than just on the sequence mixing part.
Okay, but hang on. If the optimal XLSTM is bigger, doesn't that just shift the problem? Like, maybe training is cheaper, but then inference is more expensive because the model's larger. More parameters usually means more memory, slower inference.
That is an excellent point, and it leads directly to the next result, which is why the context length comparison is so critical. They tested this across different context lengths, 2K, 8K, and up to 16K tokens.
And this is where the quadratic scaling of transformers really becomes an issue.
Absolutely. Think about it. In a transformer, that self-attention mechanism looks at all pairs of tokens. The cost grows quadratically with the sequence length, T. So as you increase T from 2K to 8K to 16K, a rapidly increasing chunk of your fixed compute budget gets eaten up just by the attention calculations.
Which leaves less budget for the actual model parameters.
Precisely. So for the transformer, the compute optimal model size, N star, has to drop significantly as the context length grows. You're forced to use a smaller model just to afford the cost of processing the long sequence.
Okay, I see. The attention cost starts to dominate everything else.
Exactly. But now look at XLSTM. Because its sequence processing is linear in T, increasing the context length has a much smaller impact on the overall compute breakdown.
So its optimal model size doesn't need to shrink as much.
Right. The paper shows N star for XLSTM drops only mildly, and stays much more stable across those different context lengths. Most of the FLOPs in XLSTM remain allocated to the model parameters themselves, the depth, the hidden dimensions, not the sequence mixing part.
That stability feels really important. It means the architecture itself isn't fundamentally crippled by long contexts in the same way.
It's a key resilience factor, yeah. It suggests XLSTM is structurally better prepared for a long context world. And you see this reflected in the data side, too. The optimal dataset size, D star, for transformers actually decreases with longer context because training gets so expensive. For XLSTM, D star slightly increases.
Wow. So the transformer has to use smaller models and less data optimally when context gets long, just because attention's so costly.
That's what the data suggests. The attention cost is basically cannibalizing the whole training budget.
Which leads us neatly into section 4, inference. This is where the rubber meets the road for deployment, right? Where training efficiency hopefully translates into real-world speed and cost savings.
Exactly. And they look at the two main stages of inference. First, the prefill stage, processing the initial prompt. The metric here is time to first token, TTFT. How long until the user sees the first output?
And the second stage.
The generation stage, generating subsequent tokens one by one. The metric is step time. How fast can it produce the rest of the output?
Okay, so let's start with TTFT. How do they compare?
At short prompt lengths, the TTFTs were pretty similar, no huge difference. But as the prompts got longer, hitting that 16K context length again, the XLSTM models were consistently faster, like 30 to 50% lower TTFT for models of the same size.
And that's just the linear versus quadratic cost playing out again, but this time in the latency the user experiences.
Precisely. Less compute needed for the prefill means a faster first token, but the step time results are arguably even more dramatic.
How so?
For the transformer, as the prompt length increases, the key value cache, the KV cache, the attention S to look at, grows. Attending over a larger and larger KV cache takes more time, so the transformer's step time gets slower as the context it needs to remember gets longer.
Which is super annoying for users, right? You paste in a long document and the response starts trickling out slower and slower.
Exactly. But XLSTM, its step time was found to be basically independent of the prefill length.
Completely independent. How does that work?
It's down to the recurrent nature of the MLSTM blocks within XLSTM. It doesn't need to reattend over the entire past history stored in a massive KV cache for every single new token. It updates its internal memory state recursively.
So the cost of generating the next token doesn't blow up as the conversation or context grows.
Right. The necessary information is already compressed or summarized in its internal state. The computational cost per step stays roughly constant.
And they had a specific comparison point that really highlighted this.
Yeah, there's a striking detail in the paper. For that 16K prefill length, the largest XLSTM model they tested actually had a lower step time, faster generation than the smallest transformer they tested.
Wow. Okay, that's a massive difference in practical performance, especially for long context applications.
It really is. It means if you're dealing with long documents or extended dialogues, XLSTM should provide a much smoother, faster generation experience after the initial prompt processing.
And they back this up with theory too, not just empirical measurements.
They did. They developed a detailed runtime model based on both FLOPs and memory operations, MEMOPs, using the roofline model framework. Their theoretical predictions closely match the actual measured performance, which adds a lot of confidence that these trends will hold, even for potentially larger models or different hardware setups.
Okay, so let's pull everything together. If you had to summarize the grand conclusion from this paper.
The conclusion seems pretty clear-cut based on their findings. XLSTMs show superiority in training efficiency. They're Pareto dominant and scale reliably even when overtraining. And crucially, they're demonstrably faster in inference, offering better TTFT, especially at long contexts, and a constant step time, which is a major advantage over transformers.
And these advantages just get bigger as context length increases.
Exactly. It really positions XLSTM as more than just, an academic curiosity. It looks like a genuinely scalable, high-performance alternative architecture.
We should, of course, mention the limitations noted in the paper.
Right. This study focused mainly on cross-entropy loss as the performance metric and single GPU inference speed. Future work definitely needs to verify these scaling advantages on actual downstream tasks, particularly long context tasks, and also in more complex real-world multi-GPU deployment scenarios.
Still, the core findings on scaling and efficiency are pretty compelling.
They are, and it brings up that point about optimal model size again. The fact that compute-optimal XLSTMs are larger but their size is stable with context length, It suggests they're just inherently built better for these parameter-hungry, long context tasks.
Which leads us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener. Given the relentless push towards longer context windows for things like complex reasoning, R-key, multi-document analysis, all these applications put immense pressure on computational costs. Does the transformer's fundamental quadratic scaling bottleneck mean its time is, limited? Will architectures like XLSTM, designed specifically to avoid that ON2 complexity, inevitably become the new default, the computational baseline for the next wave of frontier LLMs, driven simply by economic necessity?
It's a powerful question. This paper certainly throws down a significant quantitative gauntlet, challenging the decade-long dominance of self-attention perhaps more directly than ever before.
Something to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the shifting scaling landscape.
Yeah, fascinating stuff.
We'll see you next time.